The untold story about the politics behind the Council of Nicaea. The year 325 CE. A gathering that would reshape the course of human history was about to unfold. Not in some divine sanctuary or sacred temple, but in a palace hall thick with political tension. Picture this. Hundreds of bishops from across the Roman Empire. Summoned not by God, but by an emperor who had barely a decade earlier been sacrificing to pagan gods. They came bearing theological disputes that were tearing communities apart. But what they didn't fully grasp was that they were about to become pawns in one of the most masterful political maneuvers ever orchestrated. This is the untold story of the Council of Nicaea. And I guarantee that what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view one of Christianity's most foundational moments. Because while history books paint this as a sacred gathering where divine truth emerged through holy debate, the reality is far more unsettling. This was politics at its most calculated. Religion weaponized for empire and truth decided not by revelation but by imperial decree. What you're about to learn isn't just ancient history. The patterns established at Nicaea echo through every major religious and political institution today. The blueprint for controlling belief, manufacturing consensus, and turning faith into a tool of state power was written in that hall nearly 17 centuries ago. And once you see it, you'll never look at organized religion the same way again. But before we dive into the machinations that unfolded in that council chamber, we need to understand the world that made Nicaea necessary. Because this story doesn't begin with theology or divine inspiration. It begins with an empire in crisis and an emperor who understood that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a sword, but a creed. The Roman Empire of 325 was a giant with clay feet. Imagine trying to govern a territory that stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the edges of Persia. For decades, the empire had been hemorrhaging. Civil wars had become routine with rival generals carving up territories like warlords. The economy was in shambles. Inflation was rampant. And barbarian tribes pressed against every frontier like wolves circling a wounded animal. Into this chaos stepped Constantine, a man whose rise to power reads like something out of Game of Thrones. He had clawed his way to the top through a series of brutal civil wars, eliminating rivals with the cold efficiency of a seasoned politician. By 312, he controlled the western half of the empire. But his hold on power was anything but secure. The empire was fractured, exhausted, and desperately needed something to bind it together. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Constantine claimed to have had a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, seeing a cross in the sky with the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether this vision was genuine religious experience or brilliant political theater, we'll never know. What we do know is that Constantine was far too shrewd a politician to let a good crisis go to waste. Christianity in 325 was nothing like the unified institution we know today. It was a patchwork of competing groups, each claiming to possess the true understanding of Jesus's message. Some saw Jesus as fully divine, others as fully human, and still others as something in between. There were communities that emphasized mystical experience, others that focused on ethical living, and some that built elaborate theological systems around Greek philosophy. This diversity wasn't just academic, it was explosive. Riots broke out in major cities over theological disputes. Entire congregations split apart. Bishops hurled accusations of heresy at each other, with the venom of political rivals. In Alexandria, one of the empire's most important cities, the conflict between a priest named Eris and his bishop had reached a fever pitch that threatened to tear the entire eastern provinces apart. Eris wasn't some fringe figure. He was an eloquent preacher with a massive following, and his message was devastatingly simple. Jesus was divine, yes, but not equal to God the Father. He was the first and greatest of God's creations, exalted above all others, but still subordinate to the supreme deity. To modern this might sound like splitting theological hairs, but in the 4th century, it was dynamite. The opposing camp led by figures like Athanasius insisted that this subordination of Jesus undermined the very foundation of Christian salvation. If Jesus wasn't fully divine, how could his death and resurrection have cosmic significance? The debate raged through churches, monasteries, and schools of theology, creating fault lines that threatened to split not just the church, but the empire itself. And here's where Constantine's political genius becomes clear. He didn't care which side was theologically correct. What he cared about was that the dispute was creating exactly the kind of division his fragile empire couldn't afford. A fractured religion meant fractured loyalty, and fractured loyalty meant potential rebellion. Constantine had inherited an empire that had tried for centuries to destroy Christianity through persecution. Diocletian's Great Persecution, which had ended just a decade before Constantine's rise, had been the most systematic attempt yet to eradicate the faith. Christians had been tortured, executed, and driven underground. Their books had been burned, their churches demolished, their leaders hunted like criminals. But persecution had failed spectacularly. Instead of destroying Christianity, it had only strengthened it. The blood of martyrs had indeed become the seed of the church. And by Constantine's time, Christians made up perhaps 10 to 15% of the empire's population. More importantly, they were concentrated in urban centers among educated elites and in positions of influence throughout the imperial bureaucracy. Constantine recognized what his predecessors had missed. If you can't beat them, co-opt them. Rather than continuing the feudal policy of persecution, he would embrace Christianity and reshape it to serve his political needs. The Edict of Milan in 313 had granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. But that was just the opening move. Nicaea was the endgame. The genius of Constantine's strategy lay in its subtlety. He didn't simply declare himself the head of the church or impose his will through brute force. Instead, he positioned himself as the concerned protector of Christian unity, the benevolent emperor who only wanted to help resolve the disputes that were tearing the faithful apart. It was manipulation disguised as magnanimity, control masked as care. The summons to Nicaea went out in early 325, and it was unlike anything the Christian world had ever seen. Bishops from across the empire were invited to attend at imperial expense. Their travel costs were covered, their accommodations provided, their meals prepared by imperial chefs. For many of these men, particularly those from remote provinces, it was the journey of a lifetime. But this imperial hospitality came with strings attached. The bishops weren't gathering as free men debating matters of conscience. They were guests of the emperor, dependent on his goodwill, operating under his watchful eye. Every meal they ate, every bed they slept in, every conversation they had was a reminder of who held the real power in this gathering. The location itself was carefully chosen. Nicaea, modern-day Iznik in Turkey, was strategically positioned near Constantine's new capital of Constantinople, close enough for the emperor to oversee personally, but far enough from Rome to signal that this was the beginning of a new age. The old capital with its pagan temples and republican traditions was giving way to a Christian empire centered on the Bosphorus. As the bishops arrived throughout the spring of 325, the magnitude of what was happening became clear. Never before had representatives of the global church gathered in one place. Men who had survived persecution, who bore the scars of torture, who had spent decades building communities in the face of imperial hostility, now found themselves dining with the very emperor whose predecessors had tried to destroy them. The psychological impact was profound. For generations, Christians had defined themselves in opposition to Roman power. Now they were being invited to share in it. The transition from persecuted minority to imperial religion was happening so fast it must have felt like whiplash. Some bishops embraced the opportunity, seeing it as divine vindication. Others must have wondered what price would be demanded for this sudden imperial favor. Constantine's opening address to the council set the tone for everything that followed. Dressed in imperial purple, adorned with gold and jewels, he entered the hall like the autocrat he was. The bishops rose to honor him, a gesture that spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. Here was the emperor, not even baptized, presiding over a gathering of the church's highest officials. His speech was a masterpiece of political rhetoric disguised as religious concern. He spoke of unity, of peace, of the need to resolve disputes that were causing scandal to the faith. He positioned himself not as a theological authority but as a facilitator, a concerned outsider who only wanted to help the church speak with one voice. It was brilliant theater and it worked. But beneath the pious language and imperial pageantry, the real agenda was crystal clear. Constantine needed unity and he needed it fast. The empire was still fragile, still threatened by internal division and external enemies. A fractured church meant a fractured society, and that was a luxury he couldn't afford. The bishops had been summoned not to discover truth, but to manufacture consensus. The debates that followed revealed just how deep the divisions ran. The Arian controversy wasn't just about abstract theology. It was about power, authority, and the fundamental question of who got to define Christian truth. Arius and his supporters arrived with their own political networks, their own wealthy patrons, their own vision of what the church should become. The anti-Arian faction, meanwhile, was equally determined to crush what they saw as a dangerous heresy. Led by figures like Hosius of Cordoba, Constantine's own theological advisor. They came armed with philosophical arguments borrowed from Greek thought and political backing from the imperial court. What emerged wasn't a free exchange of ideas, but a carefully orchestrated political theater. The emperor's preferences became clear through subtle signals, imperial nods, and the strategic placement of supporters in key positions. Bishops who might have been inclined toward Arian positions found themselves isolated, their funding threatened, their careers hanging in the balance. This wasn't theology. This was politics at its most ruthless. Wrapped in the language of faith and sanctified by imperial authority. The council wasn't discovering divine truth. It was manufacturing it under pressure according to the political needs of a crumbling empire. And in that manufactured consensus lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The merger of church and state. The criminalization of dissent. The transformation of faith from a lived experience into a loyalty test. Nicaea wasn't just about settling a theological dispute. It was about creating a new kind of power. One that could reach into the human soul itself and demand not just obedience, but belief. The implications of what was happening in that council chamber would echo through the centuries, shaping not just Christianity but the very nature of religious and political authority in the Western world. This was the moment when faith became policy. When truth became whatever those in power declared it to be. The mechanics of control began to reveal themselves as the debates intensified. What looked like theological discourse was actually something far more calculated. The bishops weren't just arguing about the nature of Christ. They were unknowingly participating in the construction of an entirely new form of governance. One that would blend religious authority with imperial power in ways that had never been attempted before. Consider the language being used. The famous phrase homosio of the same substance wasn't drawn from Scripture. Jesus never used that word. The apostles never wrote it. It came straight from Greek philosophy, from the abstract terminology of academics and intellectuals. This wasn't accidental. By forcing the debate into philosophical jargon, Constantine and his advisors were ensuring that ordinary believers would be dependent on educated elites to interpret their own faith. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A fisherman in Galilee, a farmer in Egypt, a merchant in Rome. None of these people would understand what homoios meant. They needed bishops to explain it. Bishops who needed imperial approval to maintain their positions. The complexity wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. It created a hierarchy of understanding with the emperor at the top. bishops in the middle, and ordinary believers at the bottom. The voting process itself reveals the political machinery at work. This wasn't a careful deliberation where each bishop weighed the evidence and reached his own conclusions. The pressure was enormous and it came from every direction. Imperial officials monitored the proceedings. Wealthy patrons made their preferences known. Career prospects hung in the balance. We know from surviving accounts that some bishops were literally afraid to speak their minds. The memory of persecution was still fresh. Many of these men bore physical scars from torture. And they understood what happened to those who opposed imperial will. The transition from being hunted criminals to honored guests hadn't erased the fundamental reality. Cross the emperor at your peril. The genius of Constantine's approach was that he didn't need to threaten anyone directly. The implications were clear enough. Bishops who aligned with his preferred outcome found themselves invited to imperial banquets, granted audiences with the emperor, offered positions of influence. Those who resisted found themselves marginalized. Their travel expenses questioned. Their accommodations suddenly less comfortable. But the real masterstroke was yet to come. As the debates raged and positions hardened, Constantine began floating a solution that seemed to come from divine inspiration, but was actually calculated political compromise. The creed that emerged wasn't a revelation. It was a negotiated settlement designed to exclude Arius while keeping as many bishops as possible within the imperial fold. The language was carefully crafted to sound definitive, while remaining just vague enough to allow multiple interpretations. True God and true man could mean different things to different people. But it served the emperor's primary purpose. It drew a clear line between acceptable and unacceptable belief. Once that line existed, it could be policed. And police it they did. The aftermath of Nicaea revealed the true nature of what had been accomplished. Arius wasn't just defeated theologically. He was destroyed politically. His writings were ordered burned. Not just hidden or suppressed, but actively sought out and fed to the flames. His followers were exiled. Their property confiscated. Their names erased from official records wherever possible. This was the birth of a new concept. Heresy as a crime against the state. Before Nicaea, religious disagreement was a matter between communities, teachers, and students. After Nicaea, it became a legal category with real consequences. Believe the wrong thing about the nature of Christ, and you weren't just mistaken. You were a criminal. The enforcement mechanisms were brutal and effective. Imperial bureaucrats worked with church officials to identify suspected Arians. Loyalty tests were administered. Recite the creed. Affirm the correct doctrine. Prove your orthodoxy. Those who refused or hesitated faced escalating consequences. Loss of position. Confiscation of property. Exile. And in some cases, death. But here's what makes the politics of Nicaea so insidious. It worked. Within a generation, most Christians had accepted the new orthodoxy not because they were convinced by theological arguments, but because the alternatives had been systematically eliminated. When you burn the books and exile the teachers, only one version of the story survives. The council also established a precedent that would haunt Christianity for centuries. The idea that truth could be determined by committee. Once it was accepted that bishops gathered under imperial authority could settle doctrinal disputes definitively, the door was opened for endless future councils, each one claiming to speak with the voice of God, while operating according to the logic of politics. This is why the decades after Nicaea were filled with theological chaos. Far from settling the Arian controversy, the council had simply driven it underground. Different emperors favored different positions. New councils were called to reverse previous decisions. Bishops were exiled and restored depending on who held power. The eternal truth established at Nicaea kept changing based on political circumstances. Constantine himself revealed the hollow nature of his commitment to Nine Orthodoxy. Toward the end of his life, he began showing sympathy for Arian positions. Some sources suggest he was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop. The man who had orchestrated the condemnation of Arianism apparently had second thoughts about his own theological creation. This inconsistency exposes the central fraud at the heart of Nicaea. It was never about discovering divine truth. It was about creating a useful political tool. When that tool no longer served Constantine's purposes, he was perfectly willing to abandon it. The creed wasn't sacred to him. It was strategic. The transformation of Christianity from a diverse movement into a standardized institution had profound consequences that extended far beyond theology. Before Nicaea, Christian communities had developed organically, responding to local needs and circumstances. There were different traditions of worship, different emphases in teaching, different ways of organizing community life. After Nicaea, this diversity was systematically crushed. The new orthodoxy demanded uniformity, not just in belief, but in practice. Liturgies were standardized. Hierarchies were formalized, and deviation from approved patterns became grounds for accusation of heresy. The rich tapestry of early Christianity was reduced to a single empire-approved pattern. The economic dimensions of this transformation are often overlooked but were crucial to its success. Constantine didn't just offer theological backing to Orthodox bishops. He offered them wealth and power. Church buildings began receiving imperial funding. Bishops were granted legal privileges. Christian institutions were exempted from certain taxes. Orthodoxy became quite literally profitable. This created a powerful incentive structure that had nothing to do with spiritual truth. Ambitious men saw that the path to wealth and influence ran through the church hierarchy, but only if they towed the orthodox line. The episcopate became another branch of the imperial bureaucracy staffed by men whose primary loyalty was to the political system that sustained them. The psychological impact on ordinary believers was devastating. Christianity had originally offered an alternative to the brutal hierarchies of Roman society. It promised that the last would be first, that the powerful would be brought low, that God sided with the poor and oppressed against their exploiters. After Nicaea, Christianity became a prop for those very hierarchies. The same imperial system that had crucified Jesus and persecuted his followers for centuries was now claiming divine sanction. The religion of the cross became the religion of the crown. And that transformation hollowed out much of its moral authority. The irony is almost too perfect. A faith founded by a man who had nowhere to lay his head was now being defined by men dining in imperial palaces. A movement that had proclaimed God's preferential option for the poor was now being shaped by the political needs of the wealthy and powerful. The council established patterns of religious control that echo through history right up to the present day. The idea that complex theological questions can be settled by authoritative decree. That dissent from orthodox positions represents dangerous heresy. That unity is more important than truth. All of these concepts trace their lineage back to that gathering in Nicaea. Look at any major religious institution today, and you'll see the DNA of Nicaea. Hierarchical authority structures, standardized creeds and confessions, mechanisms for identifying and excluding heretics, the merger of religious and political power. The blueprint was written in 325, and we're still living with its consequences. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of Nicaea is how successfully it buried its own political origins. The story that survived depicts the council as a triumph of divine guidance over human confusion. A moment when the Holy Spirit worked through faithful bishops to preserve eternal truth against dangerous error. The reality was almost precisely the opposite. Human political calculation masquerading as divine revelation. Imperial power manufacturing religious consensus. Truth decided not by evidence or argument, but by the needs of a crumbling empire, desperate for unity at any cost. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea thought they were defending the faith. In reality, they were participating in its domestication, its transformation from a prophetic voice challenging worldly power into a useful tool serving that power's purposes. They came believing they were servants of God. They left as servants of Caesar. Though most of them never realized the transformation had occurred. The mechanics of how this transformation unfolded reveal just how sophisticated the political operation really was. Constantine didn't simply impose his will through brute force. That would have been too obvious, too crude for such a delicate operation. Instead, he orchestrated what can only be described as a masterclass in psychological manipulation, using techniques that would make modern political consultants take notes. The seating arrangements alone tell the story. This wasn't some egalitarian gathering where all voices carried equal weight. Bishops known to favor imperial positions were placed closest to the throne. Those suspected of Arian sympathies found themselves relegated to the back, literally marginalized before the debates even began. Every detail was calculated to reinforce the hierarchy of power and influence. The emperor's personal interventions were equally strategic. When debates grew too heated, Constantine would step in with calls for Christian charity and unity. When discussions veered toward positions he opposed, imperial advisors would suddenly discover urgent business requiring certain bishops to step away from the proceedings. When votes needed to be secured, private audiences with the emperor became available to key figures. But here's where the operation gets truly brilliant. Constantine managed to make his preferred outcome seem inevitable, while maintaining the illusion that the bishops were making free decisions. The creed that emerged wasn't presented as the emperor's choice, but as the natural consensus of faithful men guided by divine wisdom. The political engineering was so smooth that many participants genuinely believed they had witnessed a miracle of unity, rather than a masterpiece of manipulation. The language crafted at Nicaea reveals the sophisticated understanding of power that drove the entire enterprise. Every word was chosen not for its theological precision, but for its political utility. The famous phrase about Christ being begotten not made wasn't drawn from any biblical text. It was philosophical jargon designed to exclude specific opponents, while sounding authoritative to those who didn't understand its technical meaning. This linguistic strategy served multiple purposes simultaneously. It created the appearance of scholarly depth and ancient authority. It established a vocabulary that only educated elites could fully comprehend, making ordinary believers dependent on clerical interpretation. And most importantly, it provided precise tools for identifying and excluding dissident. The genius lay in the ambiguity. The creed was specific enough to exclude Arians, but vague enough to accommodate various other positions within the anti-Arian coalition. Different bishops could sign the same document while understanding it in significantly different ways, united only in their opposition to the excluded position and their loyalty to the imperial settlement. The enforcement mechanisms that followed Nicaea reveal the true nature of what had been accomplished. This wasn't just a theological conference that happened to have political implications. It was a political operation disguised as a theological conference. The aftermath made that crystal clear. Within months of the council's conclusion, imperial bureaucrats were working with church officials to implement what can only be described as an ideological purge. Lists were compiled of suspected Arian sympathizers. Loyalty oaths based on the 9 formula were required for certain positions. Libraries were searched for prohibited texts. The machinery of persecution that had once targeted Christians was now being used by Christians against other Christians. The speed and efficiency of this operation reveals that it had been planned well in advance. You don't accidentally create a comprehensive system for identifying, isolating, and eliminating religious dissident. The infrastructure for enforcement was already in place before the council ended, suggesting that the outcome had been predetermined rather than discovered through genuine debate. The psychological warfare was particularly sophisticated. Rather than simply executing heretics, which might have created martyrs in sympathy for their cause, the imperial system deployed more subtle forms of pressure. Careers were destroyed gradually. Social networks were systematically dismantled. Economic opportunities vanished. The message was clear: conform or face slow strangulation. This approach was devastatingly effective because it avoided the obvious brutality that might have provoked resistance. Victims couldn't point to dramatic persecution or obvious injustice. Instead, they faced 1,000 small cuts. each individually deniable, but collectively fatal. It was persecution by bureaucracy, oppression through administrative procedure. The international dimensions of the Nine Settlement reveal Constantine's broader imperial strategy. The council wasn't just about managing domestic religious disputes. It was about projecting Roman power across cultural and linguistic boundaries by creating a standardized version of Christianity. Constantine was essentially franchising Roman imperial ideology throughout the known world. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Christian communities from Britain to Ethiopia, from Spain to India were now expected to conform to doctrinal formulations crafted in a palace hall according to the political needs of a Roman emperor. Local traditions, cultural expressions, indigenous theological insights. All of this was subordinated to imperial standardization. The missionary implications were enormous. Christianity had originally spread through organic networks of traders, refugees, and voluntary missionaries who adapted the message to local contexts and concerns. After Nicaea, expansion became a matter of imperial policy with orthodoxy enforced by political pressure rather than spiritual conviction. This transformation had profound consequences for how the faith developed in different regions. Areas that accepted Nine Orthodoxy were incorporated into the imperial system and benefited from political support, economic advantages, and military protection. Regions that resisted found themselves marginalized, impoverished, and eventually conquered or absorbed. The Gothic tribes provide a perfect case study. Many had been converted by Arian missionaries before Nicaea, and maintained those theological positions for centuries afterward. This created a convenient pretext for Roman military campaigns against them. They weren't just barbarians threatening the frontier. They were heretics threatening the faith. Theology became a tool of imperial expansion. The educational and intellectual consequences of Nicaea were equally far-reaching. Before the council, Christian thought had been characterized by remarkable diversity and creativity. Different schools of interpretation flourished. Competing explanations were debated and intellectual curiosity was generally encouraged within broad boundaries. After Nicaea, this intellectual freedom was systematically curtailed. The boundaries of acceptable thought were narrowed dramatically. Questions that had once been open for discussion became matters of settled orthodoxy. Curiosity about alternative explanations was redefined as dangerous flirtation with heresy. The impact on scholarship was devastating. Libraries were purged of prohibited materials. Teachers were required to demonstrate orthodoxy before being allowed to instruct students. Research into controversial topics was discouraged or forbidden entirely. The vibrant intellectual culture that had characterized early Christianity was replaced by a sterile conformity that prioritized safety over insight. This intellectual stagnation had consequences far beyond theology. The same mindset that discouraged questioning religious orthodoxy also inhibited scientific inquiry, philosophical exploration, and artistic innovation. When you train people not to think too deeply about the most important questions of existence, you inevitably diminish their capacity for original thought in other areas as well. The social engineering aspects of the Nine Settlement were perhaps most insidious of all. Constantine and his advisors understood that controlling belief requires more than just silencing dissent. You have to reshape the entire cultural environment in which ideas develop and spread. The imperial sponsorship of Orthodox Christianity created powerful incentives for conformity that extended far beyond formal church hierarchies. Merchants discovered that displaying the right religious symbols was good for business. Administrators found that Orthodox credentials opened doors to advancement. Scholars learned that certain research topics were career suicide, while others led to imperial patronage. Over time, these incentive structures became self-reinforcing. Parents taught their children to mouth orthodox formulas not because they believed them, but because they wanted their children to succeed. Teachers emphasized approved doctrines not from conviction, but from professional necessity. The apparatus of conformity became so pervasive that genuine belief became almost irrelevant. This social conditioning was remarkably effective because it operated below the level of conscious awareness. Most people weren't consciously choosing to betray their convictions for material advantage. They were simply adapting to an environment where certain ideas were rewarded and others were punished. The system manufactured consensus through environmental pressure rather than direct coercion. The generational impact was particularly profound. Children who grew up in this environment never experienced the intellectual freedom that had characterized earlier periods. To them, religious uniformity seemed natural, even divinely ordained. The very idea that there might be legitimate alternatives to orthodox positions became literally unthinkable. The international precedent established at Nicaea had consequences that extended far beyond Christianity or even religion. The council demonstrated that ideological uniformity could be imposed across vast territories through a combination of political pressure, economic incentives, and social engineering. This template would be replicated countless times throughout history by rulers seeking to consolidate power through belief control. The model was remarkably adaptable. Replace Christian orthodoxy with communist ideology, nationalist doctrine, or any other belief system, and the fundamental mechanics remain the same. Convene authorities who appear to represent the community. Orchestrate a consensus that serves political needs. Then use state power to enforce conformity, while presenting the outcome as the natural expression of popular will. The psychological techniques pioneered at Nicaea became standard tools of political manipulation. The careful staging of events to create the appearance of spontaneous agreement. The use of abstract language that sounds authoritative while remaining malleable in practice. The systematic elimination of alternatives while maintaining the fiction of free choice. These methods have been refined over the centuries, but their basic structure traces back to that gathering in 325. The theological implications of what happened at Nicaea were equally revolutionary, though they're often overlooked in discussions that focus on political dimensions. By establishing the precedent that doctrinal questions could be settled by committee vote, the council fundamentally altered the epistemological foundations of Christian faith. Before Nicaea, religious authority had been diffuse and largely experiential. Communities looked to teachers, scriptures, traditions, and personal spiritual insight for guidance. There was no single institution with the authority to declare certain interpretations definitively correct and others heretical. After Nicaea, this changed dramatically. Religious truth became whatever the properly constituted authorities declared it to be. The locus of authority shifted from the community of believers to the hierarchy of officials. From spiritual discernment to institutional decree. From the movement of the Spirit to the vote of the committee. This transformation had profound implications for how subsequent generations would understand the nature of religious truth itself. Instead of something discovered through prayer, study, and communal discernment, truth became something manufactured by councils and enforced by institutions. The dynamic living quality of early Christian thought was replaced by the static certainty of official doctrine. The irony is that this institutional approach to truthism was completely foreign to the Jewish and early Christian traditions from which the faith had emerged. Neither Jesus nor the apostles had established anything resembling the conciliar system that developed after Constantine. The entire apparatus of councils, creeds, and canonical enforcement was an imperial innovation imposed upon a movement that had originally been far more organic and decentralized. But perhaps the most profound consequence of Nicaea was how it changed the relationship between Christianity and power itself. Before Constantine, the faith had maintained a prophetic stance toward worldly authority. Sometimes supportive, often critical, always maintaining a certain independence that allowed it to speak truth to power when necessary. After Nicaea, this prophetic independence was systematically compromised. The Church became so entangled with imperial power that it lost the ability to critique that power effectively. How can you speak truth to Caesar when Caesar is paying your salary, building your churches, and enforcing your orthodoxy? This co-optation was so complete that it became almost invisible. Subsequent generations of Christians grew up assuming that close collaboration between church and state was natural, even divinely ordained. the idea that faith might require maintaining some distance from political power. That prophetic religion might need to preserve its independence in order to fulfill its calling became almost incomprehensible. The transformation was so thorough that when later reform movements tried to recover the prophetic dimension of Christianity, they were often accused of innovation or heresy. The imperial version of the faith had become so normalized that alternatives were difficult even to imagine, much less implement. The global spread of this imperial Christianity had consequences that are still unfolding today. When European powers began their colonial expansion centuries later, they carried with them not just the Christian message, but the nine model of how that message should be organized and controlled. Indigenous Christian communities that had developed different traditions were forced to conform to European orthodoxy, or face marginalization. The missionary enterprise became in many ways an extension of the same imperial logic that had driven Constantine's council. Local expressions of faith were systematically suppressed in favor of standardized European formulations. Cultural diversity was sacrificed on the altar of institutional uniformity. The rich tapestry of global Christianity was reduced to variations on a single imperial theme. This process of theological colonization often accompanied and reinforced political and economic colonization. Indigenous peoples were told that their traditional ways of understanding the sacred were not just different but wrong, even demonic. Conversion to Christianity meant not just accepting new beliefs, but adopting European cultural forms and submitting to European ecclesiastical authority. The psychological damage from this process is still being uncovered today. Entire cultures were taught to despise their own spiritual traditions and intellectual capabilities. The message was clear. Truth comes from the imperial center, not from local insight or indigenous wisdom. This internalized colonization proved far more durable and destructive than mere political control. The legacy of Nicaea thus extends far beyond the ancient world into the very structures of global Christianity today. The denominational divisions that characterize modern Christianity, the emphasis on doctrinal conformity over ethical practice, the close relationships between religious institutions and political power. All of these patterns trace their origins back to that gathering in 325. Understanding this history doesn't require rejecting Christian faith, but it does demand honest acknowledgement of how political considerations have shaped what many assume to be purely spiritual developments. The creeds recited in churches today aren't timeless truths revealed from heaven. They're historical documents crafted under specific political pressures to serve specific imperial needs. This recognition opens up possibilities for reimagining what Christianity might become if it could recover some of the diversity and independence that characterized its pre-Constantian phase. What would a faith look like that prioritized ethical transformation over doctrinal conformity? What kind of communities might emerge if spiritual authority were more distributed and less hierarchical? These aren't just historical questions. They're contemporary challenges facing anyone who wants to understand how religious institutions actually function in the world and how they might be reformed to serve human flourishing rather than institutional power. The patterns established at Nicaea continue to operate today, not just in religious contexts, but throughout society. Wherever you see authorities manufacturing consensus through carefully controlled processes, while maintaining the fiction of free deliberation, you're witnessing the heirs of Constantine's political innovation. The techniques have been refined, the technologies have advanced, but the basic logic remains the same. Control the process, shape the narrative, eliminate the alternatives, and present the outcome as inevitable. Whether we're talking about religious doctrine, political ideology, or corporate messaging, the NYN model provides the template. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward developing resistance to them. Once you understand how manufactured consensus works, it becomes much harder to mistake it for genuine agreement. Once you see how authority figures use abstract language and procedural complexity to obscure their political goals, you can begin to ask more penetrating questions about what's really happening. The story of Nicaea is ultimately a story about the corruption of idealism by power, the transformation of prophetic movements into imperial institutions, and the ease with which even the most sacred convictions can be manipulated for political ends. It's a cautionary tale that every generation needs to hear because every generation faces the same temptations and the same choices. The bishops who gathered in 325 thought they were defending eternal truth. They ended up manufacturing political orthodoxy. The difference between those two things is the difference between authentic spiritual insight and ideological control. Learning to recognize that difference and to choose the former over the latter may be one of the most important skills any thinking person can develop. The decades following Nicaea revealed just how hollow the victory really was. If the council had truly settled the matter through divine revelation, you'd expect the controversy to end there. Instead, what followed was theological chaos that made the pre-council disputes look like friendly disagreements. Within 5 years of the council, Arian bishops were being recalled from exile. Constantine himself began showing sympathy for positions he had just helped condemn. His son, Constantius, who inherited the eastern half of the empire, actively promoted Arian theology and persecuted 9 bishops. The eternal truth established in 325 kept changing depending on who sat on the throne. This instability wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The council had established that religious truth was whatever the emperor said it was, which meant it could change with each new ruler. What looked like doctrinal chaos was actually the logical result of subordinating theology to politics. When faith becomes a tool of state policy, it inevitably becomes subject to the same shifting calculations that drive all political decisions. The human cost of this system was staggering. Bishops were exiled and recalled. Exiled again and recalled again. Depending on imperial whims, entire communities were forced to switch theological positions multiple times within a single generation. Families were torn apart by loyalty tests that had nothing to do with genuine spiritual conviction and everything to do with political survival. Consider the fate of Anasius, the fierce opponent of Arianism, who had helped craft the 9 position. Despite being on the winning side, he was exiled 5 separate times by different emperors. His crime wasn't changing his theology. It was maintaining the same position while political winds shifted around him. The very consistency that should have been his vindication became his liability in a system where theological truth was subordinated to imperial convenience. The international dimensions of this theological chaos reveal the broader imperial strategy at work. Different regions of the empire were played against each other through competing religious loyalties. The eastern provinces with their more philosophical Greek culture tended toward Arian positions. The western provinces with their more legalistic Latin mindset generally favored 9 orthodoxy. This wasn't accidental. Divide and conquer had always been a cornerstone of Roman imperial strategy, and Constantine's successors applied it to religious disputes with ruthless efficiency. By keeping different regions committed to opposing theological positions, they ensured that no single religious authority could challenge imperial power. The church remained dependent on the state for protection against its own internal enemies. The educational transformation that accompanied this system was particularly insidious. Before Nicaea, Christian learning had been characterized by intellectual curiosity and creative interpretation. Scholars like Origen had developed sophisticated theological systems through careful study and spiritual insight. Different schools of thought competed in the marketplace of ideas, and the best arguments generally prevailed. After Nicaea, this intellectual freedom was systematically destroyed. Truth became whatever the current council declared it to be. Regardless of evidence or argument, scholars learned to anticipate political winds rather than follow logical reasoning. The quality of theological thinking declined precipitously as creativity was replaced by conformity, and insight was subordinated to orthodoxy. The library at Alexandria provides a perfect case study. Once the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, it became a battleground for competing orthodoxies. Books were burned not because they were poorly argued, but because they supported the wrong political positions. Scholars were driven out not because they were incompetent, but because they asked inconvenient questions. This intellectual stagnation had consequences far beyond theology. The same mindset that discouraged questioning religious orthodoxy also inhibited scientific inquiry, philosophical exploration, and artistic innovation. When you train an entire civilization not to think too deeply about the most important questions of existence, you inevitably damage their capacity for original thought in every area. The social engineering aspects of the post-9 system were even more sophisticated than the intellectual control mechanisms. Constantine and his successors understood that lasting ideological transformation required reshaping the entire cultural environment, not just silencing prominent dissident. The imperial sponsorship of Orthodox Christianity created powerful incentive structures that operated throughout society. Merchants discovered that displaying the right religious symbols was essential for business success. Craftsmen learned that certain types of religious art brought imperial commissions while others brought unwanted scrutiny. Even farmers found that participation in Orthodox religious festivals could affect their access to markets and credit. These economic pressures were particularly effective because they seemed natural rather than coercive. No one was forcing people to adopt Orthodox positions. They were simply responding rationally to an environment where orthodoxy was rewarded and dissent was punished. The system manufactured consensus through environmental pressure rather than direct intimidation. The generational impact was devastating. Children who grew up in this environment never experienced the intellectual and spiritual freedom that had characterized earlier Christianity. To them, religious uniformity seemed normal, even divinely ordained. The idea that there might be legitimate alternatives to orthodox positions became literally unthinkable. Parents reinforced this conditioning not from conviction, but from protective instinct. They taught their children to mouth the right formulas not because they believed them but because they wanted their children to succeed in life. Teachers emphasized approved doctrines not from theological insight but from professional necessity. The machinery of conformity became self-perpetuating. The psychological mechanisms at work here are remarkably similar to those observed in modern totalitarian systems. When deviation from approved thinking becomes socially and economically costly, most people learn to self-censor rather than risk the consequences of honesty. Over time, this external conformity often transforms into internal conviction as people convince themselves they believe what they're required to say. The international expansion of this imperial Christianity had consequences that reverberated across continents and centuries. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed in the West, the institutional structures created at Nicaea survived and spread. Germanic tribes that conquered Roman territories often adopted not just Christianity, but the entire imperial model of how that Christianity should be organized. This meant that the political theology crafted to serve Constantine's empire became the template for medieval European Christendom. Kings claimed divine sanction for their authority by positioning themselves as protectors of Orthodox faith. Bishops gained political power by aligning themselves with royal interests. The merger of throne and altar that began at Nicaea became the defining characteristic of European civilization for over 1,000 years. The missionary implications were equally profound. When European powers began their global expansion, they carried with them not just the Christian message, but the New York model of how that message should be controlled and standardized. Indigenous Christian communities that had developed different theological traditions were forced to conform to European orthodoxy or face marginalization. The process was remarkably similar to what had happened within the Roman Empire after 325. Local expressions of faith were systematically suppressed in favor of imperial formulations. Cultural diversity was sacrificed on the altar of institutional uniformity. The rich variety of global Christianity was reduced to variations on a single European theme. This theological colonization often preceded and prepared the way for political and economic colonization. Indigenous peoples were taught that their traditional ways of understanding the sacred were not just different but demonic. Conversion to Christianity meant not just accepting new beliefs, but adopting European cultural forms and submitting to European ecclesiastical authority. The psychological damage from this process is still being uncovered today. Entire cultures were conditioned to despise their own spiritual insights and intellectual capabilities. The message was clear. Truth originates at the imperial center. never from local wisdom or indigenous understanding. This internalized colonization proved far more durable than mere political control. The denominational structure of modern Christianity bears the clear imprint of these imperial origins. The emphasis on doctrinal conformity over ethical practice. The hierarchical organization of religious authority. The close relationships between churches and political power. All of these patterns trace directly back to the Constantinian settlement. Even Protestant attempts to reform Christianity have generally operated within the basic framework established at Nicaea. The reformers might have rejected papal authority, but they retained the concilia model of truth determination. They might have emphasized scripture over tradition, but they still insisted on doctrinal uniformity within their own communities. The imperial DNA proved remarkably persistent. The most tragic irony is how completely this imperial version of Christianity displaced the prophetic tradition from which it had emerged. The figure who proclaimed that his kingdom was not of this world became the patron saint of earthly empires. The movement that had originally challenged worldly power structures became their most effective legitimizing force. This transformation was so complete that when later reformed movements tried to recover the prophetic dimension of Christianity, they were often accused of innovation or heresy. The imperial version had become so normalized that alternatives were difficult even to conceive. The very idea that faith might require maintaining some critical distance from political power became almost incomprehensible. The techniques of ideological control pioneered at Nicaea have been refined and adapted countless times throughout history. Replace Christian orthodoxy with any other belief system. Nationalist ideology, communist doctrine, corporate messaging, and the fundamental mechanics remain the same. Convene authorities who appear to represent the community. Orchestrate a consensus that serves elite interests. Then use institutional power to enforce conformity, while maintaining the fiction of voluntary agreement. Modern advertising, political campaigning, and corporate communications all employ variations of the 9 model. The language has been updated. The technologies have advanced. But the basic strategy remains unchanged. Control the narrative. Eliminate alternatives. And present manufactured consensus as natural consensus. The Internet age has created new possibilities for both control and resistance. On one hand, digital platforms can be used to enforce ideological conformity more efficiently than Constantine ever dreamed possible. Algorithms can suppress dissenting voices. Echo chambers can reinforce approved thinking, and social pressure can be applied at unprecedented scale and speed. On the other hand, the same technologies that enable control also create opportunities for circumventing it. Information that would once have been successfully buried can now be preserved and shared. Alternative perspectives that would once have been completely marginalized can find audiences. The monopoly on narrative control that characterized the post-9 world has become much harder to maintain. Understanding the history of Nicaea is crucial for anyone who wants to navigate this new information environment effectively. Once you recognize the patterns of manufactured consensus, you become much less susceptible to them. Once you understand how authorities use procedural complexity and abstract language to obscure their political goals, you can ask more penetrating questions about what's really happening. The psychological techniques that made the 9 settlements so effective. The appeal to unity. The demonization of alternatives. The equation of dissent with disloyalty are still being used today in contexts that have nothing to do with religion. Political parties, corporations, and ideological movements all employ variations of these strategies to maintain control over their followers. The antidote to these techniques is not cynicism, but critical thinking. Not the assumption that all authority is illegitimate, but the recognition that all authority needs to be questioned. Not the rejection of community and tradition, but the insistence that genuine community requires space for honest disagreement, and authentic tradition makes room for growth and change. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea in 325 thought they were serving eternal truth. They ended up serving imperial power. The difference between those two forms of service is often subtle in the moment, but becomes clear over time. Learning to recognize that difference and to choose truth over power, when they conflict, remains one of the most important challenges facing anyone who cares about human freedom and dignity. The legacy of Nicaea extends far beyond ancient history into the very structure of modern institutions. Wherever you encounter systems that claim to represent community consensus, while actually serving elite interests, wherever you see complex procedures designed to obscure simple power dynamics, wherever authorities invoke sacred principles to justify worldly ambitions, you're witnessing the heirs of Constantine's political innovation. The story of Nicaea is ultimately a story about the corruption of idealism by expedience, the transformation of prophetic movements into imperial institutions, and the ease with which even the most sincere convictions can be manipulated for political ends. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history, because the temptations it represents are fundamental to human nature. Power always seeks legitimacy, and there's no more powerful legitimacy than divine sanction. Religious movements always need resources and protection, and there's no more reliable source than state support. The attraction is mutual, and the corruption is almost inevitable, unless both sides maintain vigilant awareness of the dangers involved. The challenge for contemporary readers is not to reject all forms of religious or political authority, but to develop the discernment necessary to distinguish between authentic and manufactured legitimacy. This requires understanding how these systems actually work, not how they claim to work. It requires looking beneath official narratives to understand the interests and incentives that really drive institutional behavior. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the same patterns that played out in 4th century Christianity continue to operate today in countless variations. The costumes change, the vocabulary evolves, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Those who understand these dynamics are far less likely to be manipulated by them. The council that met in Nicaea nearly 17 centuries ago continues to shape our world in ways that most people never recognize. Its legacy lives on not just in the creeds recited in churches, but in the basic assumptions about authority, truth, and power that govern our institutions. Understanding that legacy is essential for anyone who wants to live as a free and thoughtful human being in a world where manufactured consensus is increasingly sophisticated and pervasive. The bishops who signed the 9 Creed thought they were preserving eternal truth for future generations. In reality, they were demonstrating how easily eternal truth can be subordinated to temporary political needs. That demonstration remains relevant today, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living warning about the dangers that await any society that forgets the difference between genuine consensus and manufactured agreement. The real genius of the 9 operation becomes clear when you examine how it fundamentally rewrote the rules of religious authority itself. Before Constantine's intervention, Christianity had operated more like a network than a hierarchy. Communities were connected by shared stories and traveling teachers. But there was no central command structure that could impose uniform beliefs across vast distances. What emerged from Nicaea was something unprecedented in the history of religion. A standardized belief system backed by imperial enforcement mechanisms. This wasn't just about settling a theological dispute. It was about creating an entirely new form of social control that could reach into the most intimate aspects of human consciousness. The psychological warfare deployed at Nicaea was remarkably sophisticated. Constantine understood that you can't simply force people to believe something. You have to make them want to believe it. Or at least make the alternative seem so dangerous that conformity becomes the only rational choice. The council achieved this through a carefully orchestrated campaign of social pressure that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Consider the treatment of bishops who initially resisted the emerging consensus. They weren't immediately arrested or executed. That would have been too crude and might have created martyrs. Instead, they found themselves gradually isolated. Colleagues who had once been allies began avoiding them. Invitations to important gatherings stopped arriving. Financial support mysteriously dried up. The message was unmistakable. Conform or face professional and social death. This approach was devastatingly effective because it avoided the obvious brutality that might have provoked organized resistance. Each individual punishment seemed reasonable, even justified. After all, the empire was simply rewarding loyalty and withdrawing support from troublemakers. The cumulative effect, however, was the systematic destruction of independent thought within the Christian leadership. The economic dimensions of this transformation revealed just how thoroughly the imperial system had penetrated religious life. Before Constantine, Christian communities had been largely self-supporting, relying on voluntary contributions from members who often faced persecution for their beliefs. This economic independence had allowed them to maintain theological independence as well. After Nicaea, this changed dramatically. Imperial patronage began flowing to Orthodox communities while suspected heretics found themselves cut off from funding. Church buildings received government subsidies, but only if they adhered to approved doctrines. Bishops gained access to imperial courts and influence, but only if they demonstrated proper theological loyalty. This created a powerful feedback loop that reinforced Orthodox positions regardless of their intellectual merit. Communities that embraced Nine theology thrived materially, while those that resisted struggled to survive. Over time, this economic pressure accomplished what theological arguments alone never could have achieved: the systematic elimination of alternative perspectives. The international implications of this economic strategy were equally profound. As Christianity spread beyond the Roman Empire's borders, it carried with it not just theological positions, but an entire model of how religious authority should be structured and funded. Communities that wanted to maintain connections with the imperial church had to accept not just its doctrines, but its institutional forms. This meant that theological diversity, which had once been Christianity's greatest strength, became its greatest liability. The organic adaptation that had allowed the faith to take root in diverse cultures was replaced by rigid standardization that served imperial, rather than local needs. The rich tapestry of early Christian thought was reduced to a single pattern approved by bureaucrats in Constantinople. The linguistic manipulation employed at Nicaea deserves special attention, because it established patterns that continue to influence religious and political discourse today. The council's language was carefully crafted to sound authoritative, while remaining sufficiently vague to accommodate different interpretations within the Orthodox camp. Take the famous phrase of one substance with the Father. This sounds definitive and profound. But what does it actually mean? The Greek term homousios was philosophical jargon that most ordinary believers couldn't understand. Even among educated Christians, there were significant disagreements about its precise implications. The ambiguity wasn't accidental. It was strategic. By using abstract philosophical language, the Council accomplished several goals simultaneously. It excluded Arian positions with precision, while maintaining flexibility for orthodox interpretations. It established a vocabulary that required clerical mediation to understand, making ordinary believers dependent on educated elites. And most importantly, it created the impression of intellectual depth and ancient authority. Even though the terms were recent innovations, this linguistic strategy became a template for future religious and political movements. Complex jargon serves as a kind of ideological password. Those who can use it fluently are assumed to be trustworthy insiders, while those who question it are marked as dangerous outsiders. The ability to recite approved formulas becomes more important than the ability to think critically about their meaning. The enforcement mechanisms that emerged after Nicaea reveal the true nature of what had been accomplished. This wasn't just a theological conference that happened to have political implications. It was a political operation disguised as a theological conference. The aftermath made this crystal clear through the systematic deployment of state power to suppress religious dissent. Within months of the council's conclusion, imperial bureaucrats were working with church officials to implement what can only be described as an ideological purge. Lists were compiled of suspected heretics. Loyalty oaths based on 9 formulations were required for certain positions. Libraries were searched for prohibited texts. The machinery of persecution that had once targeted Christians was now being used by Christians against other Christians. The speed and thoroughness of this operation reveals that it had been planned well in advance. You don't accidentally create a comprehensive system for identifying, isolating, and eliminating religious dissident. The infrastructure for enforcement was already in place before the council ended, suggesting that the outcome had been predetermined rather than discovered through genuine debate. The psychological impact of this enforcement campaign extended far beyond its immediate victims. Every Christian leader understood that their career prospects, their community's survival, and their personal safety now depended on demonstrating proper theological loyalty. This created a climate of fear that stifled intellectual inquiry and creative theological thinking for generations. The transformation was so complete that many Christians began to internalize the new orthodoxy not from conviction but from psychological necessity. When expressing certain ideas becomes literally dangerous, most people learn to stop thinking those thoughts altogether. The imperial system didn't just control behavior. It reshaped consciousness itself. The international precedent established at Nicaea had consequences that extended far beyond the Roman Empire and far beyond Christianity. The council demonstrated that ideological uniformity could be imposed across vast territories through a combination of political pressure, economic incentives, and social engineering. This template would be replicated countless times throughout history. The model proved remarkably adaptable. Replace Christian orthodoxy with any other belief system, communist doctrine, nationalist ideology, corporate messaging, and the fundamental mechanics remain the same. Convene authorities who appear to represent the community, orchestrate a consensus that serves elite interests, then use institutional power to enforce conformity while maintaining the fiction of voluntary agreement. Modern political parties, corporations, and ideological movements all employ variations of the Nicene strategy. The language has been updated and the technologies have advanced, but the basic approach remains unchanged. Control the narrative, eliminate alternatives, and present manufactured consensus as natural consensus. The educational transformation that accompanied the Nine Settlement was particularly insidious because it operated over generations rather than within them. The council didn't just silence existing dissident. It prevented future dissident from emerging by reshaping how people were taught to think about religious questions. Before Nicaea, Christian education had been characterized by intellectual curiosity and methodological diversity. Students were exposed to different schools of thought and encouraged to develop their own theological positions through careful study and spiritual reflection. The best teachers were those who could help students think more clearly, not those who could make them conform more completely. After Nicaea, this educational freedom was systematically curtailed. Truth became whatever the current authorities declared it to be. Regardless of evidence or argument, students learned to anticipate political wins rather than follow logical reasoning. The quality of theological thinking declined precipitously as creativity was replaced by conformity, and insight was subordinated to orthodoxy. This intellectual stagnation had consequences that extended far beyond theology. The same mindset that discouraged questioning religious orthodoxy also inhibited scientific inquiry, philosophical exploration, and artistic innovation. When you train people not to think too deeply about the most important questions of existence, you inevitably damage their capacity for original thought in every area of life. The social engineering aspects of the post-9 system were even more sophisticated than the intellectual control mechanisms. Constantine and his successors understood that lasting ideological transformation required reshaping the entire cultural environment, not just silencing prominent critics. Imperial sponsorship of Orthodox Christianity created powerful incentive structures that operated throughout society at every level. Merchants discovered that displaying the right religious symbols was essential for business success. Artisans learned that certain types of religious art brought lucrative commissions while others brought unwanted scrutiny. Even farmers found that participation in Orthodox festivals could affect their access to markets and credit. These economic pressures were particularly effective because they seemed natural rather than coercive. No one was explicitly forcing people to adopt orthodox positions. They were simply responding rationally to an environment where orthodoxy was rewarded and dissent was punished. The system manufactured consensus through environmental pressure rather than direct intimidation. The generational impact was devastating and designed to be so. Children who grew up in this environment never experienced the intellectual and spiritual freedom that had characterized earlier Christianity. To them, religious uniformity seemed normal, even divinely ordained. The idea that there might be legitimate alternatives to orthodox positions became literally unthinkable. Parents reinforced this conditioning not necessarily from conviction, but from protective instinct. They taught their children to recite the approved formulas, not because they necessarily believed them, but because they wanted their children to succeed in a world where nonconformity was dangerous. Teachers emphasized orthodox doctrines not from theological insight, but from professional survival. The machinery of conformity became self-perpetuating across generations. The psychological mechanisms at work here are remarkably similar to those observed in modern totalitarian systems. When deviation from approved thinking becomes socially and economically costly, most people learn to self-censor rather than risk the consequences of honesty. Over time, this external conformity often transforms into internal conviction as people convince themselves they believe what they're required to say. This process of internalization is crucial to understanding how the Nine Settlement achieved such lasting success. The council didn't just impose orthodoxy from above. It created conditions where orthodoxy would seem to emerge naturally from below. People began to police themselves and each other, making formal enforcement mechanisms increasingly unnecessary. The denominational structure of modern Christianity still bears the clear imprint of these imperial origins. The emphasis on doctrinal conformity over ethical practice, the hierarchical organization of religious authority, the close relationships between churches and political power. All of these patterns trace directly back to the Constantinian settlement. Even Protestant attempts to reform Christianity have generally operated within the basic framework established at Nicaea. The reformers might have rejected papal authority, but they retained the concilia model of truth determination. They might have emphasized scripture over tradition, but they still insisted on doctrinal uniformity within their own communities. The imperial DNA proved remarkably persistent and adaptable. The most tragic irony is how completely this imperial version of Christianity displaced the prophetic tradition from which it had emerged. The figure who had proclaimed that his kingdom was not of this world became the patron saint of earthly empires. The movement that had originally challenged worldly power structures became their most effective legitimizing mechanism. This transformation was so thorough that when later reform movements tried to recover the prophetic dimension of Christianity, they were often accused of innovation or heresy. The imperial version had become so normalized that alternatives were difficult even to conceive. The very idea that faith might require maintaining some critical distance from political power became almost incomprehensible to most believers. The techniques of ideological control pioneered at Nicaea have been studied, refined, and adapted countless times throughout history. Modern advertising, political campaigning, and corporate communications all employ sophisticated variations of the basic nine model. The costumes have changed and the technologies have evolved, but the fundamental strategy remains remarkably consistent. The digital age has created new possibilities for both control and resistance. On one hand, online platforms can be used to enforce ideological conformity more efficiently than Constantine ever imagined possible. Algorithms can suppress dissenting voices. Echo chambers can reinforce approved thinking. And social pressure can be applied at unprecedented scale and speed. On the other hand, the same technologies that enable control also create opportunities for circumventing it. Information that would once have been successfully buried can now be preserved and shared across networks that authorities cannot fully monitor or control. Alternative perspectives that would once have been completely marginalized can find audiences and build communities of support. Understanding the history of Nicaea is crucial for anyone who wants to navigate this new information environment effectively. Once you recognize the patterns of manufactured consensus, you become much less susceptible to them. Once you understand how authorities use procedural complexity and abstract language to obscure their political goals, you can ask more penetrating questions about what's really happening. The psychological techniques that made the NYN settlement so effective. The appeal to unity. The demonization of alternatives. The equation of dissent with disloyalty are still being deployed today in contexts that have nothing to do with religion. Political parties, corporations, and ideological movements all employ variations of these strategies to maintain control over their followers and expand their influence over society. The antidote to these techniques is not cynicism but critical thinking. Not the assumption that all authority is illegitimate, but the recognition that all authority needs to be questioned. Not the rejection of community and tradition, but the insistence that genuine community requires space for honest disagreement, and authentic tradition makes room for growth and change. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea in 325 thought they were serving eternal truth. They ended up serving imperial power. The difference between those two forms of service is often subtle in the moment but becomes unmistakable over time. Learning to recognize that difference and to choose truth over power, when they inevitably conflict, remains one of the most important challenges facing anyone who cares about human freedom and intellectual integrity. The story of Nicaea ultimately reveals something fundamental about the relationship between truth and power. Truth doesn't need enforcement mechanisms to survive. It can defend itself through evidence and argument. Power, on the other hand, always seeks legitimacy through claims to truth. When these two forces become confused or deliberately conflated, the result is almost always the corruption of both. The council that met nearly 17 centuries ago continues to shape our world in ways that most people never recognize. Its legacy lives on not just in religious institutions but in the basic assumptions about authority, consensus, and legitimacy that govern our political, educational, and cultural institutions. Understanding that legacy is essential for anyone who wants to think clearly about how power actually operates in human societies. The manufactured consensus achieved at Nicaea wasn't just a historical anomaly. It was a prototype for techniques of social control that have been refined and deployed repeatedly throughout subsequent centuries. Every time you encounter systems that claim to represent community agreement while actually serving elite interests, every time you see complex procedures designed to obscure simple power dynamics, every time authorities invoke sacred principles to justify worldly ambitions, you're witnessing variations on the Constantinian innovation. The challenge for contemporary readers is not to become cynical about all forms of authority, but to develop the discernment necessary to distinguish between authentic and manufactured legitimacy. This requires understanding how these systems actually function, not how they claim to function. It requires looking beneath official narratives to understand the interests and incentives that really drive institutional behavior. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the patterns that played out in 4th century Christianity continue to operate today in countless variations across every sector of society. The vocabulary changes, the technologies evolve, but the fundamental dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Those who understand these dynamics are far less likely to be manipulated by them, and far more capable of creating genuinely democratic alternatives. The bishops who signed the Nine Creed believed they were preserving eternal truth for future generations. In reality, they were participating in a demonstration of how easily eternal truth can be subordinated to temporary political needs. That demonstration remains relevant today, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living reminder of the vigilance required to protect authentic inquiry from the corrupting influence of concentrated power. The ripple effects of what Constantine accomplished at Nicaea didn't stop at the borders of his empire or even at the boundaries of his century. What he created was a blueprint for how to weaponize belief itself, turning the most intimate aspects of human consciousness into instruments of political control. And that blueprint has been copied, refined, and deployed by every authoritarian system that followed. But here's what makes the 9 model so insidious. It doesn't look like tyranny. It looks like consensus. Doesn't feel like manipulation. Feels like unity. The bishops who walked out of that council chamber genuinely believed they had participated in a sacred moment of divine guidance. They had no idea they just helped create the most sophisticated system of thought control the world had ever seen. Consider how brilliantly the entire operation was designed. Constantine didn't need to threaten anyone directly or issue explicit commands about what conclusions the bishop should reach. The environment itself did the work for him. The imperial hospitality. The carefully orchestrated seating arrangements. The subtle signals of approval and disapproval. All of this created a psychological atmosphere where dissent became literally unthinkable. The bishops weren't coerced in any obvious way. They were seduced. They were made to feel important, valued, part of something grand and historic. And in return for that feeling, they surrendered their intellectual independence without even realizing they'd given it up. It was voluntary servitude disguised as honorable service. This psychological manipulation was so effective that it became invisible to its victims. The bishops who signed the creed didn't see themselves as collaborators in a political scheme. They saw themselves as faithful servants of God, who had been blessed with the opportunity to participate in clarifying divine truth. The more completely they were controlled, the more free they felt. And that's the truly terrifying genius of the 9 operation. It didn't just impose orthodoxy from above. It made orthodoxy feel like it was emerging from below. It created conditions where people would police themselves and each other, making formal enforcement mechanisms seem almost unnecessary. The most effective prison is one where the inmates lock themselves in and throw away the key. The language games played at Nicaea reveal another layer of sophistication in this system of control. By forcing theological discussions into abstract philosophical terminology, Constantine and his advisors accomplished something remarkable. They made the faith incomprehensible to ordinary believers while simultaneously making it seem more authoritative and ancient. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A farmer in Gaul. A merchant in Alexandria. A soldier on the Rhine frontier. None of these people had any idea what homousios meant. They needed educated intermediaries to translate the creed into language they could understand. And those intermediaries, of course, were the same bishops who had crafted the creed under imperial supervision. This created a permanent class of religious interpreters whose power depended entirely on maintaining the system that had created them. They had every incentive to make theology seem complex, mysterious, and beyond the grasp of ordinary people. The more incomprehensible the official doctrines became, the more indispensable the official interpreters became. But the real stroke of genius was how this linguistic complexity served to insulate the power structure from criticism. When someone questioned the creed, defenders could always respond that the critics simply didn't understand the sophisticated theological concepts involved. Dissent was transformed from principled disagreement into evidence of ignorance or malice. This pattern of using specialized jargon to deflect criticism, while maintaining intellectual authority, has been replicated in countless contexts since Nicaea. Academic disciplines, professional associations, political movements, corporate cultures, all of them employ variations of the same strategy. Create an insider vocabulary that outsiders can't penetrate. Then use that vocabulary barrier to dismiss challenges to your authority. The economic warfare deployed in the aftermath of Nicaea was equally sophisticated and equally effective. Constantine and his successors understood that you don't need to execute heretics when you can simply starve them. By controlling access to imperial patronage, they could make orthodoxy profitable and dissent economically suicidal. This created a market-based enforcement mechanism that was far more subtle and sustainable than direct persecution. Communities that embraced 9 theology found themselves swimming in imperial funding. Those that resisted found themselves cut off from the financial networks that made institutional survival possible. Over time, economic pressure accomplished what theological arguments alone never could have achieved. The beauty of this approach was its deniability. No one was being persecuted for their beliefs officially. They were simply being excluded from the benefits that came with imperial favor. If they wanted to maintain their theological positions, they were free to do so. They just had to accept the economic consequences of that choice. This economic coercion was particularly effective because it operated through seemingly neutral market mechanisms. Orthodox communities thrived because they were better connected, better funded, better positioned to take advantage of economic opportunities. Heretical communities struggled because they lacked access to these same advantages. The system made orthodoxy look like success and dissent look like failure. The international implications of this economic strategy were staggering. As Christianity spread beyond the Roman Empire's borders, it carried with it not just theological positions, but an entire model of how religious institutions should be structured and funded. Communities that wanted to maintain connections with the imperial church had to accept not just its doctrines but its economic dependencies. This meant that theological diversity, which had once been Christianity's greatest strength, in adapting to different cultures became its greatest liability. The organic flexibility that had allowed the faith to take root in diverse societies was replaced by rigid standardization that served imperial, rather than local needs. The generational impact of the Nine Settlement reveals perhaps its most insidious dimension. The council didn't just change the beliefs of the bishops who attended. It fundamentally altered how future generations would learn to think about religious questions. It established patterns of intellectual subordination that would persist for centuries. Children who grew up in the post-9 world never experienced the theological diversity and intellectual freedom that had characterized earlier Christianity. To them, the idea that there might be multiple legitimate ways of understanding Christ's nature was literally inconceivable. The boundaries of acceptable thought had been so thoroughly internalized that they felt like natural limits rather than artificial constraints. This cognitive conditioning was reinforced through every aspect of Christian education. Students learn not to ask certain questions, not to explore certain possibilities, not to think certain thoughts. The curriculum itself became a form of ideological programming that produced graduates who were intellectually incapable of challenging the system that had shaped them. The most tragic aspect of this educational transformation was how it affected the brightest and most creative minds. Instead of producing innovative theologians who could develop Christianity in new and vital directions, the post-9 system churned out sophisticated defenders of predetermined conclusions. Intellectual energy that might have been used for genuine discovery was channeled into elaborate justifications of inherited orthodoxy. So there you have it. The untold story behind one of Christianity's most foundational moments. What happened at Nicaea in 325 wasn't divine revelation guiding faithful bishops to eternal truth. It was imperial politics at its most calculating. Religion weaponized for empire. A manufactured consensus disguised as sacred unity. The patterns established in that council chamber. The merger of faith and power. The criminalization of dissent. The transformation of belief into a loyalty test. Continue to shape our world today. Every time you see authorities manufacturing agreement while eliminating alternatives, you're witnessing the heirs of Constantine's political innovation. Understanding this history doesn't just change how you see Christianity. It equips you to recognize these same techniques of control wherever they appear in modern life.